Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mazzoro again, and today I want to talk about our third benthic region, coral reefs. Coral is probably one of the hot button issues in marine science, and certainly it's where all the money is in marine science in terms of research. So it's a little unfortunate that I have to cram all this big lesson about coral that I could teach into one little small snippet, but them's are the times, so here we go. Today what I really want to talk to you about is just the very, very brief sort of helicopter ride through coral. We're going to talk about what coral reefs are, how they form, we're going to talk about different types of coral reefs, and then we're going to talk about how organisms are adapted to live on coral reefs, how organisms are adapted to compete for nutrients and space on a coral reef, because coral reefs are actually the most biologically dense ecosystems on Earth. There are more organisms in 1 square foot of a coral reef than any other ecosystem on Earth. Any tropical rainforest, any deciduous forest, any desert, tundra, whatever. And such a biologically dense area, so many organisms crammed into such a small space, means that nutrients are going to be at a premium because all those organisms are going to eat and suck all the nutrients out of the water. And space is going to be at a premium as well. So if you're going to live on a coral reef, you have to be adapted to live in not only very, very nutrient-poor environments, but also very, very spatially poor environments as well. And we'll talk about how those organisms adapt in those environments. So, what is coral? Coral is an organism, it's an animal that lays down a limestone skeleton. And coral, along with other things that lay down these limestone skeletons, like oysters and like coralline algae, which is a type of algae that lays down a limestone skeleton, kind of all accumulate together, all laying down this rock, this limestone, over thousands or millions of years, and eventually what you get is this huge superstructure of limestone called a coral reef. It's important to understand that all of these organisms that attribute to this limestone skeleton are only on the very, very outside of it. In fact, coral itself is only just a very top thin, almost microscopically thin layer of living tissue on top of a bunch of dead rock that its ancestors laid down for it. So even though you have this huge superstructure that you see, the Great Barrier Reef is the largest coral reef in the world, twice the size of Pennsylvania, really only the very, very top microscopically thin layer of the Great Barrier Reef is living. And all the rest of the stuff below that thin living layer is dead. How does a coral reef form? How do you get this superstructure? Well, even though you're looking out on a coral reef and you see this huge abundance of animals and huge flora of different types of coral, it's actually a little deceiving because really coral itself, the animal that starts laying down these limestone skeletons a lot of the time, it's hardly ever very diverse on a coral reef. Like I said, the Great Barrier Reef is twice the size of Pennsylvania, and yet it only has about 1,500 genetically different types of coral on it. That may sound like a lot, but you have to remember that there's more than 1,500 people in a concert or probably in your high school. This is an area that's twice the size of Pennsylvania, the Great Barrier Reef. And it has less organisms, less different types of organisms on it than are organisms in your high school, people in your high school. And that's because coral doesn't usually sexually reproduce. Coral asexually reproduces. In order to get a coral reef, what you have is usually have just one polyp that clones itself over and over and over and over again. Thousands or hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of times. And so one polyp becomes 2 and those 2 become 4 and the 4 become 8. And what you get is the appearance of diversity when in fact you just have one thing that's cloned over and over and over and over again as you have in this brain coral. It only takes one founder polyp, one polyp, to create this superstructure called a reef. There are, in fact, 3 types of coral reefs: fringing reefs, barrier reefs, and atolls. Fringing reefs are reefs that butt right up against a coastline. If you've ever been to white sand beaches, those white sand beaches are coral, and they're coral that was on a fringing reef, a coral reef that went right up against the coastline and started to break up because of the weathering action of the waves breaking on it all the time. Then there are barrier reefs. Barrier reefs form a distance away from the coastline. This is actually what the Great Barrier Reef is. It's just a big barrier reef. There's the coastline and then a body of water called the lagoon and then the reef far out in the distance. If you remember the movie Castaway, he was actually on a barrier reef, right? He was on an island, right? And he got on the raft in the beginning of the movie, and he goes to, no spoilers, but he goes to actually try to get off the island by paddling out. And what he paddles out to is actually where the reef is. That's why when he gets thrown from the raft, he cuts his leg on a piece of coral. That's where the reef actually starts, and why those waves were breaking way out in the distance. Barrier reefs have a distance of water between the coastline and the reef themselves. Last, there's atolls. Atolls are a little mysterious. They're rings of coral that form in the middle of the ocean, usually the Pacific Ocean. And we'll get to kind of how that forms in a second, but let's actually show you pictorially what the difference is between these reefs. So right here, you have a reef that butts right up against the shoreline, right? There's really no differentiation between the shoreline and the reef itself. That's a fringing reef. Whereas here, we have a barrier reef, a shoreline, and then a lagoon or a body of water, and then the reef itself. In Castaway, like I said, he started here. He paddles out and out, and then he gets thrown from his boat, thrown for his raft, and he cuts his leg on that little piece of coral right there, and then he swims back, and that's where he stays for the next 3 years. And that's where a barrier reef is. Barrier reefs, I'm just going to mention this because I think it's interesting. Barrier reefs actually have a really high reef crest. That's the highest part of the reef. And it's so high, in fact, that it can actually punch above the surface at some point and form sand coral islands. In Europe, they're called sand cays, but in America, we call them sand keys. In fact, the Florida Keys are ancient sand keys of an ancient barrier reef that went extinct about 60 million years ago. So, that's what the Florida Keys are. They're actually parts of a barrier reef. Here's a atoll, a ring of coral that encloses a lagoon. And as you see by this picture, you get no land anywhere around it. So how does this coral form? What's it forming on? Now, you don't know this yet, but coral actually needs a hard surface on which to form, and if you look here, there is no hard surface on this area to form. So how is this coral forming? Where's the hard surface? It's not forming on the bottom of the ocean. What's it originally forming on? The answer is actually a volcanic island. First, you get a volcanic island that's erupting, and a fringing reef forms around the rim of that volcanic island. That volcanic island is going to stop erupting eventually, and then it's going to stop building on itself and start eroding away. That reef, though, is living, and it's not going to start eroding away. It's going to continue to build on itself. So what you get now is sort of a slightly eroded volcanic island that there's a body of water that separates the island and the reef itself. What you get is a barrier reef. Last but not least, you have basically the complete erosion of this volcanic island, and what's left behind is just a ring of coral, seemingly in the middle of the ocean, and that's an atoll. For the longest time, we didn't know whether atolls develop around volcanic islands. It was actually Charles Darwin that first suggested it, but this process would take millions and millions of years, so we had no actual scientific proof that it happened. But what scientists did was they went to an atoll and they drilled down, and they found obsidian down here. They found volcanic glass down here, which proves that there used to be a volcanic island there, and that is in fact how atolls form. Coral, again, most biologically dense area on Earth, means two things. Means no nutrients and means no space to live. So, how do you get so much coral in such a small space? The answer is an adaptation that coral has called nutrient cycling. Coral is actually a suspension feeder. It can get material from the ocean column, from the water column itself. However, it's actually not going to do that alone and not be able to survive suspension feeding alone, and the reason is there's just not a lot of food in the water column to survive on. So in order to supplement its diet, coral lives mutualistically with an algae. And you can see inside this coral polyp, you can see tiny little microscopic algae cells forming. That algae can do something that the animal, the coral polyp, can't. It can photosynthesize. So during the day, the algae, the zooxanthellae, photosynthesizes and feeds the coral polyp. At night, the coral polyp can extend its sweeper tentacles and actually start getting food out of the water to feed the algae. Coral feeds the algae during the day. Algae feeds the coral at night. The products of photosynthesis become the starting materials for a coral polyp's respiration, and then the products of respiration become the starting materials for the zooanthellae's photosynthesis. It's mutualistic. The waste of one becomes the food for another. Coral feeds the algae at night. Algae feeds the coral during the day. This is how coral survives in such a nutrient-poor environment. Aside from being adapted to survive in a nutrient-poor environment, coral also has to be adapted to survive in a very, very dense environment where there's lots of organisms. And in order to explain to you how coral is adapted to survive in such a biologically dense environment, I have to break down into different organisms on a coral reef. We're going to talk about how hard coral is adapted to survive on a coral reef. We're going to talk about how soft coral is adapted to survive in a coral reef in such a dense environment, and then we'll talk about how fish are adapted to survive in such a dense environment. We're going to talk about how hard coral, soft coral, and fish compete for space to grow and live on a coral reef. Okay, soft coral first. How are they adapted to compete for space? Well, if you look, here's soft coral. Soft coral is closer to anemones, really, than it is to coral. You would look at it and you would say, oh, look, there's an anemone. So here's soft coral, and it's growing over this piece of rock, this piece of coral. And because soft coral is soft, it doesn't need to lay down its limestone skeleton in order to grow. It can grow a lot faster than hard coral. So one way is soft coral can compete for space by overgrowing an area, basically like ivy, taking over, growing over anything. Then we have this. When soft coral doesn't like where it isn't a rock. It can just detach and float away to a more favorable location. So that's what it does. The second way soft coral can compete for space on a coral reef is just by detaching and floating around to a better location when all of a sudden its current location isn't as good. Last, we have sea whip coral, which is a type of coral that feels like you're getting whipped when you touch it, and that's because some types of coral can sting. Soft coral competes for space in three ways: growing fast and overtaking the area that it wants to grow in, moving to a better location when the current area that's growing in isn't very good anymore, and stinging anything that gets near it in order to actually stake its claim. Hard coral is a little bit different. It can't really do those things because it's by all means a rock. So how does hard coral compete for space? Well, here's the first way. Hard coral grows rapidly up and out, almost like an umbrella or a mushroom, and that shades an area underneath it. Since coral needs to nutrient cycle, it needs light in order to feed its zooanthellae, nothing can grow under here. And as a result, this coral eventually just shaded out everything under it and killed everything under it, and that's how it competes for space and keeps its area on a coral reef. Other types of hard coral are a little bit more aggressive. They can actually extrude their guts onto other pieces of coral and digest them alive. When two pieces of hard coral get too close to each other, a more aggressive coral can literally eat the other one alive. This process usually happens over the course of one night, and it's pretty dramatic. You can actually see the coral being digested as the guts being extruded and the other coral being digested. This is a particularly big problem, by the way, in coral tanks, reef tanks, where you often have two types of coral very close to each other because coral doesn't know that it's living in a 30-gallon tank. It thinks it's living in a 10 billion gallon reef. Last, we have fish. Fish compete for space on a coral reef in two ways. The first is the lottery hypothesis. The second is the determinant hypothesis. And we don't know which one is correct or which one is wrong, but what we think is that it's some combination of the two. The lottery hypothesis says so many fish can live in one place at one time because they're the lucky ones. The unlucky ones died, and that cleared room for the lucky ones to be there. The determinant hypothesis says that so many fish can live in one place at one time because they all do very slightly different things, and as a result, they're not in direct competition with each other. The reality is we have two hypotheses that are trying to explain the same phenomenon, so it's the paradox of the either-or, what we learned in the first lesson. It's probably not one, it's probably not the other. The best explanation for how fish live in a coral reef is probably both. So that's it for today. We talked about coral reefs, what they are, and we talked about how they form from one polyp asexually reproducing. We talked about fringing reefs, barrier reefs, and atolls. We talked about how coral survives in such a nutrient-poor environment by having a mutualistic relationship with algae, which allows it to actually eat during the day and night. And we talked about how coral competes for space and nutrients on a coral reef. All right, thanks.